Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all keeping safe and well. I've got a very special guest today, Dan Kilpatrick, the chief football correspondent at the Evening Standard, talking Tottenham today. Dan, how are you?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you? I've got to say that's a really professional intro. I'm impressed.
Thank you very much. Well, Dan, firstly, thanks so much for joining us. And I really want to know what it's like working for the Evening Standard, covering Tottenham Hotspur in England, because covering Spurs, there never, ever seems to be a dull moment, is there?
No, that there doesn't. And it can be really hectic, but I think obviously it's a great job. I absolutely can't complain. It's a dream job for me, honestly. So yeah, it's great. I mean, I suppose that there are some times where you feel like everything's in order and everything's quite quiet, and then obviously you'll just be completely upended by a bit of news or a performance out of nowhere, or something will happen. But I think that's that goes with the territory. That's part of the job, really. And I think every journalist would say the same thing. Really, you're kind of at the mercy of events. But it does seem at Spurs, particularly over the last kind of 2.5 years, that they have kind of lurched from one crisis to another, I suppose. So that obviously does impact on my job quite a lot.
Dan, whilst you've been working with ESPN and now, of course, the Evening Standard, you've covered the days under Pochettino, Jose Mourinho, Mason, Nuno Espirito Santo, and now, of course, Antonio Conte. Any favourite moments for you personally, and any moments where you've just felt completely fed up?
Oh, I mean, obviously, it's boring to even say it, but Amsterdam was a particularly great moment. I mean,
yeah,
I can't really remember the third goal going in and the reaction. It was all just a bit of a blur. I've said it before, but I dread to think what my kind of piece on the whistle was like that. No, I'll never go and look at it because it was probably just rambling nonsense. But that was obviously a great moment, and the atmosphere around the stadium afterwards. Just being in the mix zone and seeing the players come through, and the whole occasion was just really special. And that's true of the whole Champions League run, really. That there were some really great nights, and I think that particularly stands out in my head and always will. In terms of moments I've been really fed up, I mean, I try not to, although I grew up as a Spurs fan, Spurs and Oxford United, I try to kind of be professional, and I don't sort of let results get me down or get me too kind of up. So I wouldn't say there's any times where I felt like really miserable about something that's happened with Spurs. It's more I'll take a kind of professional interest in it. But I think that there have been times in the last few years. I mean, I think under Jose. I mean, I've written about Jose today, and I've upset all his fans again, and I am really sorry. It's not my intention. I find him quite an interesting character to write about, but under Jose, it did feel a bit like Groundhog Day a lot of the time, and I was running out of things to say about the team, really, because I felt like it was the same issues almost every week, and that was a bit trying. It was just hard to kind of be excited about the matches, although I would say that Jose was always great in press conferences, so you always had them to kind of look forward to. But I think that was quite a difficult period for everyone associated with the club, really, whether that was sort of fans or people on the inside or people like me who were kind of reporting on it.
Who's been your favourite manager to pose questions to at press conferences, Dan?
I mean, I have to say Poch. I mean, I'm a huge Poch stan.
Everyone says Poch.
I try and be professional, but I mean, Poch was obviously great, and he remains, I think, the greatest modern manager of the club, right? So it was a real privilege to have been able to cover the club when he was there and put questions to him. He could be kind of quite grumpy. I think he had a lot of mood swings, but he was an anecdotalist. He liked to tell stories, and he did like to talk. And I think particularly after his first year at the club, he became quite an authoritative figure, I would say. He had a lot of gravitas. He became someone you wanted to really hear the views of. And that was great. Look, Jose was fantastic, as I just said. He is the master of press conferences, of media manipulation, of getting his message across. It was great to cover Jose. It was a great experience. Conte, also good in his own way, obviously very, very honest. Can be quite repetitive in what he says. There's a lot of stuff about, needing to work and improve and whatnot. But, he's obviously come in and really delivered a lot of home truths about the club and to the club. And that's been quite refreshing as well. I won't say too much about Nuno because I think, as you probably already know, he wasn't the best talker. He didn't really believe in press conferences, I don't think, as a format, and he wasn't particularly great with us, to be honest.
Dan, do you think we will see Pochettino arrive back at Spurs one day?
Yeah, I mean, it was the kind of big question not very long ago, just in the summer, really. Would Spurs be able to get him back? And I think they certainly had a go. I remember doing a piece, I can't remember when it was now. It was about Levy. It was last season, and it was about his 20 years at Spurs. And I spoke to Jesus Perez for it. And Perez said, kind of unprompted, we'll be back at Spurs one day. That there's no doubt about that. So, there certainly was a belief from Poch and Perez that they had unfinished business at Spurs and they would come back. It's just really difficult to say. You can't predict the future. I suppose what I would say is, at the moment, with Paratici in place, I think it is maybe less likely, because I think Poch's strength was his kind of relationship with Levy, and he that was a really strong relationship, and they worked well, probably better than any manager Levy's had before and since. At the moment, Levy's not really running the football side of the club. Paratici is. Poch wasn't a manager that kind of wanted to work with the director of football. I think that was pretty well known. So, if Conte left tomorrow and Poch left PSG at the same time, I'm not sure now he would necessarily be a good fit for the club, but who knows in future. I mean, he's obviously beloved and definitely has unfinished business. I'm sure it would be great if he came back having won some trophies and, could help Spurs win some trophies.
Dan, let's talk about this season so far. Of course, Nuno Espirito Santo was appointed in the summer. It didn't work out. A couple of months later, he was sacked. Antonio Conte has come in. What have you made of Tottenham's season so far? Because what I'm a little bit worried about, in the last couple of days, Antonio Conte has used the word impossible, talking about finishing in the top four. He's said to the fans to be patient. Of course, the fans don't want to be patient. We all want it all now. What have you made of the season, and what do you think that Spurs can achieve at the end of this season?
Well, the season obviously is in two distinct parts, right? I mean, there's the Nuno bit, and then there's the Conte bit. And I think the feeling about both and during both was and is kind of wildly different, because I think under Nuno, always seemed like a strange appointment. And after that initial kind of run of games in September, I think it got pretty bleak very, very quickly. And I think it was very hard to see that working long term, and it was very hard to kind of feel optimistic about where Spurs were going. That dramatically changed overnight when I think Conte came in. And suddenly, you felt like Spurs were back on the right path, and they had a world-class coach and, someone who could, lead them back to the top and get the best out of the squad, which I think you never felt was the case under Nuno. I think this week's been a really, really difficult week. A lot of that optimism has understandably kind of evaporated, just in the course of two home games. And I think, we're really seeing now how big a job this is. I think any kind of hopes that we might have had in November, December, even the start of January, that Conte was such a good coach that he'd be able to kind of improve lift the club massively without a major rebuild. I think those hopes have kind of gone now. And I think everyone acknowledges that, this is, as Conte has admittedly said many, many times, I think everyone acknowledges that this is a really long road back to the top. But I think, this week hasn't changed a huge amount, I think, or it shouldn't have. I think we always knew the squad needed a lot of work. We always knew Conte was world class. We always knew it would take more than one transfer window. So, while I think getting the top four would massively accelerate what he's trying to do, or even getting the top six, I think, in a way, not that this season's a write-off, but I'd be more interested in seeing where Spurs are, the end of next summer and the start of next season, because I think we all knew it was going to be a really kind of long road. Yeah.
I think a lot of Spurs fans are just a little bit worried, Dan, that the fact that if we don't finish in that Champions League spot, Antonio Conte may walk away in the summer. A lot of pundits have come out and said it. A lot of ex-players have come out and said it. Do you get that feeling? Because what makes Antonio Conte stay in the job at the summer? Because for me, we finished 7th in the, we got that Europa Conference League place. For me, anything better than that would be a step up. But will Antonio Conte be happy with, say, a Europa League spot?
I mean, the answer is no, obviously, over a long term. He wouldn't be happy with that at all. And I think it was quite telling after the Wolves game when Conte was asked about top four and said, I'm used to challenging for different things. He is someone who's used to winning and challenging at the top. And he's definitely not going to be content, even just to challenge around 4th place. He's going to want more of that over the long term. I think there's certainly a case that the job was bigger than Conte realised. You only have to look at some of his comments. He said things like, when you're outside the club, you can have a view, but you only understand the real situation when you come into the club. He said that a few times, which I think suggests he wasn't aware that the level was quite so low. The level of the squad was quite so low when he was looking from the outside in. But I think he would have known this would be a long rebuild, and he said that from the start. So even if it's slightly bigger than he would have thought, I think he must have been aware that he wasn't going to win the title this season. He must have been aware that there were limitations on what he could do until he got players in. So I do get the concern from fans. I do think the top four would kind of massively accelerate the project. But I think for the time being, he signed an 18-month contract, so there's nothing that suggests he's about to kind of walk away from the club.
Is there something to suggest, though, Dan, that he will be signing an extended contract?
Well, no, not yet. I mean, there hasn't been any suggestion of that as far as I'm aware. And, Conte's been sort of quite clear that it was a decision between him and the club to agree the length of contract they did. But and look, I don't think that's hugely unusual now. I think, post-pandemic, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense for clubs to tie managers to long-term deals. It's potentially really expensive. It's a new financial climate. Chelsea did the same thing with Tuchel. I think you'll see lots of clubs doing the same thing. I don't think you'll see, the days when Pardew gets a 7-year deal or whatever, or 5, even Poch getting all those 5-year contracts. I think those days are kind of gone for now. So I don't think it's especially alarming that Conte signed an 18-month deal. Obviously, I get that there's a kind of discrepancy between the length of his deal and what he's saying about how long the project will take. But, we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it, rather.
Dan, we've heard that term many times, painful rebuild. How painful do you think this rebuild is going to be? And realistically, from your point of view, being a journalist with the Evening Standard, where do you think that Spurs will finish at the end of this season with the squad that we've got?
Well, I think the rebuild is going to be painful. I was definitely one of those people that thought the players were kind of being not properly coached by Jose and Nuno, and I thought just getting Conte in would be a kind of would see a massive uplift, and I think we'd see a lot of players kind of transform pretty quickly. And again, I think almost in the last week or so, it's just becoming increasingly clear that there are just players who either aren't kind of technically at the right level or maybe aren't physically at the right level. Conte can can really coach people and improve their fitness and tell them what to do and improve their mentality. But, if they're not great athletes or they're just not great technical footballers, then there's always going to be a kind of ceiling to, what he can do with them. And I think it's been pretty telling that Bentanur has come in and Romero's come back, and that they've both looked kind of a class above, a lot of their teammates. They're just good footballers, and I think Spurs need a few more of them. So I do think there's kind of major surgery needed, and you look at that team that played against Wolves or the team that played against Saints, and immediately you think 4 or 5 of them could easily not be at the club next season, or certainly could be upgraded on quite comfortably. So I think there is a lot of work to do. In terms of where I think they'll finish, I still think top 4 is well within Spurs' grasp. It's been an awful week, and it could get worse with City on Saturday. I think everyone kind of accepts that that's very possible, if not likely. But then after that, I think when Dyer and Skip are back, and they're clearly important players, with just kind of 1 game a week for most of the season, a few games in hand, and such a good coach in Conte, there's no reason that Spurs can't be the most kind of consistent team over the course of the rest of the season, because I don't see a huge amount of consistency from United and Arsenal, United and West Ham, sorry, and I'm still not convinced about Arsenal either. So I think, realistically, if I had to put money on it, I might say 5th or 6th at the moment, but I think 4th is certainly still there for the taking.
Dan, what players do you think have really improved under Antonio Conte since his arrival?
I think Skip's really improved. He's been injured, which has been frustrating, but I think you saw, just a glimpse in a few performances before Christmas of just how kind of good he can be, and I think he'll keep getting better and better. I think we've obviously seen an uplift in Kane. He was just really not at the races when Nuno was in charge. Who else? I mean, obviously Davis has been important. I guess what's almost interesting is the players that kind of haven't had a real uplift, and that goes back to what I was talking about maybe the need to upgrade. But I think most of the squad are in a better place now than they were under Nuno. I think that's probably fair to say.
Dan, let's talk a little bit about the January transfer window. Just I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on what you made of it. Of course, players going out, notably Ndombele, Lo Celso, Brian Hill, Dele Alli going out to Everton, and then of course 2 new players coming in, Kulusevski and Bentanur. A good transfer window for you?
I think the jury's still out on the transfer window. I was broadly kind of positive about it at the time. I was sort of inclined to be positive. So I think that's generally preferable to kind of erring on the negative side. I think Spurs' big problem over the last however many years, 5, 6, 7 years, has been offloading players. That's probably the biggest thing that kind of hampered the rebuild as much as anything. Not being willing or able to get rid of unwanted players, or even not being prepared to kind of sell players, when perhaps they were still kind of valuable to the team or even at their peak. So I think there was something to be said for just kind of clearing the decks and getting rid of 4 or 5 players that Conte obviously didn't see as part of his immediate or long-term plans. Having said that, there's a danger, as we know, that kind of 3 of those players, Hill and Ndombele and Lo Celso, could all be back in the summer because they're only loans, which seems to me a bit puzzling. You let kind of 4 people go, and you're only getting money for one of them in Delhi, and clearly the kind of options in the squad, particularly in midfield, are thinner now than they were. So I think the jury's out. I mean, what we can't know is how beneficial Conte thinks not having those players in the dressing room will be. If he thinks that will really make a positive difference in the dressing room, then it's worth it just to send them on loan. If that wasn't really much of a factor, and he just didn't fancy them as footballers, then I do kind of wonder about this, this get rid of them at all costs approach. And then, in terms of the new signings, jury's still out. I think they both looked, particularly Bentanur, obviously, both looked pretty decent so far. And I think Kulusevski is obviously a bit more of a promising guy for the future, but it looks like he can play in quite a few positions, which I think is helpful. And Bentanur looks like he's going to add a kind of touch of quality and class to the midfield, which probably has been missing since Ndombele, really.
Dan, we talk about Tottenham not spending too much money in the transfer window. A lot of Spurs fans will say that. But when you look at Ndombele, Lo Celso and Bryan Hill, there is like 120, 130 million pounds of players there. Do you think that we will see them again in a Spurs shirt?
I think that's the danger, in a sense. I mean, I don't know about Hill. The kind of noises coming out of the club were that he was still a player with a long-term future, but I think Conte has been pretty clear since that, certainly at the moment, he's not ready for the Premier League, or Conte doesn't think he's suitable for the Premier League. So he might come back, in a year or 2 years. In terms of Ndombele and Lo Celso, I think, it's obvious that Conte just doesn't think that they're right for his project. But then, the danger, as I said, is that they come back and then he's got to kind of do what Mourinho did with Ndombele and what Nuno did with Ndombele, which was kind of try and freeze him out, but then eventually, reluctantly, bring him back into the fold. And I think that's, that would be a scenario, if Spurs missed out on the top four by a few points and they'd had a few worries in midfield, and then suddenly Ndombele and Lo Celso were back at the club in the summer, that would be a scenario when you're thinking, hold on, that went badly wrong in January, because, those guys, as frustrating as they were, might have been worth, a couple of points over the second half of the season. So I don't know if we'll see them. I think everyone wants those deals to become permanent, right? I think even most Spurs fans want those deals to become permanent, but we just don't know whether the two clubs are going to take up those options yet.
So much promise, though, Dan, for Ndombele. In your opinion, what went wrong with him?
Yeah, I was a huge fan of Ndombele. I think it comes down to him. I mean, I think Mourinho, had it spot on. If you go back and look at some of Mourinho's comments about him, he consistently said he could be, one of the best midfielders in the world, but it's down to him. And I think there's definitely two sides to it. There's a case that he perhaps wasn't particularly well managed at Spurs. He was a bit of an enigma. He was a bit of a maverick. He was a very different type of introverted character, and perhaps his managers didn't manage to get the best out of him, and should have tried other things to get the best out of him. But I think the bottom line is, to be a Premier League footballer in that environment, you've got to have a certain kind of standard of professionalism, I guess. And I think not one or two or three or four, but I think 5 coaches all felt that was somewhat lacking in him. I think what I would say, and no one agrees with me on this, but I kind of think that 2019 transfer window that everyone bangs on about, wasn't that bad, really. I mean, you have to remember that it was a transfer window for Pochettino, and I think Pochettino is a very different kind of coach to the man who succeeded him, Jose, and he would have put an arm around the shoulder of Ndombele. He would have, his football did suit Ndombele. He would have put him in the Ndombele role eventually, I think. So it would have been intriguing to see, how Ndombele would have worked out, had Poch stayed in the job and had things been a bit different. But, I think the first person to blame, and Nuno actually said this as well, that the kind of first person to blame for it was Ndombele himself, I think, sadly.
Yeah, I know what you mean about that window. 518 days before we signed a player, and of course Jack Clark was that player. Dan, let's come back to talking about Antonio Conte, because a lot of us fans are quite surprised on how open and honest Antonio Conte is in press conferences. Are you as a journalist?
Am I surprised about how honest he's been?
Yeah.
Maybe a little. I think, I haven't followed Conte in Italy really that closely, or even when he was at Chelsea. I was obviously covering Pochettino's Spurs at the time, and I didn't really have a wider remit than that. But it has been a little bit surprising. I think what's interesting for me is that initially Spurs fans seem to really embrace it and find it really refreshing, and now it seems to me like it's just from reading Twitter anyway that the people are starting to get fed up with it and actually wish he was a bit more positive, which I find a really interesting dynamic. It's like Spurs fans said, right, we've had enough of being told the truth now. Can we just go back to you saying nice things? But yeah,
you know what, Dan? I felt like that a couple of days ago. So refreshing to hear Antonio Conte talk the way he does. But in the last few days, I must say, I felt very down. Particularly when he said what he did about the top four. Fans are expecting too much. We've got to be patient. I don't really like that.
Okay. I guess I would say like you can't have it both ways, right? If you want kind of him to call out the club and tell say things about the say home truths about the previous transfer policy and put a bit of pressure on the board, then I guess you have to also accept that he's gonna be really blunt and realistic when it comes to talking about getting back in the Champions League. So it hasn't hugely surprised me because I think this is what Conte does. I think his playbook is always you always demand more. You're never satisfied. You're always putting pressure on the club. You're always trying to gain a few more yards and keeping the pressure ramped up. That's just what he does, and I think Spurs fans are gonna have to get used to it.
Dan, for someone like you who's very close at the club and works there a lot, especially in the press conferences, can you give us a little bit of insight of what happened to Steve Hitchen? Of course, left the club a couple of weeks ago. Will he be replaced, and will Fabio Paratici now be working alone?
I can't give you any great insight. What I can say is that I think there was a feeling that was a bit of an odd relationship, and once Paratici came in, it obviously felt a lot like Hitchen had been usurped, and you did wonder kind of how long that could keep going. Apparently they were good friends, and they worked kind of closely together. And the early part of the season, especially under Nuno, you'd always kind of see them together on the touchline, heads together, discussing things. So they obviously had a pretty close relationship. But it was also clear that Hitchen, obviously just had a lot less power and a lot less influence once Paratici came in. So not a huge surprise, I think, that he's stepped away and is on gardening leave, I think. In terms of whether Paratici will be working alone now, yeah, I suspect so. I don't think Spurs are going to hire a new kind of new technical performance director, I think Hitchen's title was. And I think if they did replace Hitchen and bring someone in that role, it would be a kind of more watered down. It would be a different role. They wouldn't hire a direct replacement. They might hire someone who was kind of, I don't know, to oversee players on loan and the transition between the academy and the first team, something like that. I don't think it would be a kind of another chief scout / technical performance advisor, which was what Hitchen's titles were.
What have you made of Fabio's time at Spurs so far, Dan?
Well, the jury's still out, obviously. Recruiting Conte is obviously a big win. In many ways, if that proves to be a success, then Paratici would have just justified his appointment just with that appointment, really, but by getting his friend, because I don't think that happens. I don't think Conte comes without Paratici. But I think the jury's still very much out on his sort of signings and sales. I already talked about the January transfer window, and then I think obviously Hill was a player he signed and let Lamela go the other way. Royale, you know, hasn't really worked out. Galini hasn't really impressed yet. And we don't know about the January signings yet. You know, the jury's still out on them as well. So I think, you know, he certainly gets a pass so far. I think mainly for Conte, but you know, there are already some pretty big questions over his signings. So yeah, I think it's fair to kind of be split on that so far.
Dan, just quickly, you mentioned Galini there. Is he expected to go back at the end of this season?
I don't know. I haven't heard anything on him at all, to be honest. Yeah, sorry.
So much speculation about Harry Kane last summer going to Manchester City. Do you think he will now be a one-club man and finish his career at Spurs?
Yeah, well, that is the that's still one of the biggest questions, and I suspect, you know, it'll start to become a big question again in the next few months, kind of having died down. Look, I mean, my expectation when Kane stayed at Spurs in the summer was that was probably his last chance or his last good chance to kind of get out, get a move, right? And I felt like, you know, on September the 1st or whatever, that, you know, the probability was more towards Kane signing a new contract than you know, eventually leaving Spurs. But I think, you know, we can't know. I think, you know, since Conte came in, things have probably been more difficult than we all expected. I think as soon as Conte came in, Kane, you know, effectively got back on side with the club and was, you know, a lot more committed to the project long term. But, you know, you obviously have to wonder, you know, is he kind of having fresh doubts given Conte's message and given kind of, you know, how difficult Conte has found it to turn things around. But look, the Spurs are will still be in a strong position in the summer. He'll still have 2 years on his contract. So I still think that, you know, the probability is towards him not going anywhere. But, you know, I don't think anything's cut and dry yet.
Dan, let's talk about the summer transfer window, because me personally, I'm expecting a lot to happen. You said earlier on this stream, 4 or 5 players, you know, in the current team could easily not be playing for Spurs next season. Realistically, how many signings do Tottenham need to make in the summer to make us a real force for next year?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I said, I think, was that 4 or 5 could easily be upgraded upon. That doesn't mean that, you know, Spurs are going to be able to upgrade on them, which is I think an important important distinction. I mean, look, so what was the question? How many do I think Spurs need, or how many do I think?
Yeah, I just think like this summer has got to be a huge summer. You know, when we all talk about backing Antonio Conte, and also please feel free to try and give me the definition of what is backing Antonio Conte in the summer.
Well, look, I think in terms of what Spurs need, yeah, you could quite easily, I think, make a case for needing 4 or 5 very strong signings. You know, I won't run through the positions. I think people, you know, will know them if they're kind of been watching this team. What's the definition of backing Conte? I think doing that, doing what he wants, you know, trying to give him what he wants, but within the club's means. You know, Conte will know that Spurs are not going to be able to spend like Chelsea or Man City. You know, he must know that. But I also think, you know, Spurs, the kind of myth that Levy or Spurs, you know, refuse to spend any money, you know, is slightly outdated. There has been an obvious uplift in spending since they moved to the stadium. I mean, you just have to look at the figures since the stadium move. You know, obviously it's made a difference, and that's, you know, largely been without crowds there. So I'm sure there will be some money to spend. I'm sure, as always, it'll be a case of having to get rid of players at the same time or first, which is always, you know, as we mentioned, a huge challenge. But yeah, you know, I certainly think the last week and well, the 2.5 years before that as well has, you know, really laid bare the fact that there are at least kind of 4 or 5, you know, maybe 6 positions in the squad that Spurs, could really, really do with strengthening in.
Dan, I was on a stream the other day, and the question come up: what was the last signing you were most excited about? I had to go back to '94, Jurgen Klinsmann. What about you?
Okay.
Yeah,
that's way back.
World-class player.
Yeah. I mean, personally, as a fan, I remember being really excited about Edgar Davids, but that's that was not when I was doing this job. It was just when I was a kind of Spurs fan. I thought that was a really exciting signing. I mean, look, I think there's to be optimistic. I do think there's reason to be excited by Bentanur. Conte's played down the signing a little bit, and said he'll need to adapt to the Premier League, and kind of almost characterised him as a sort of young, inexperienced player, along with Kulusevski. But Bentancour's, won 3 titles, played a lot of games for Juve, played a lot of Champions League games. He's a Uruguay international. He's only 24, I think, but he's a really, really experienced midfielder in European football and top level European football as well. And that's the kind of player Spurs need to be getting. Someone with that kind of pedigree, and Conte can, Conte will improve him further, I'm sure. So I think there's certainly reason for fans to be excited about him, and he's barely up to speed with English football, and I think he's already kind of stood out in the handful of appearances he's made this week.
Dan, the last time we signed a striker on a permanent deal was back in 2017, Fernando Llorente. Of course, we had Carlos Vinicius on loan last season. Surely Conte and Paratici have got to go out and buy a striker in the summer.
Yeah, I think they have, and Conte's kind of on record saying that he wants a second striker. He said he wanted, he felt that you needed to have 2 players in every position, and when it came to Kane, and the question was about Kane when he said that. So he was clearly thinking of a backup striker. So yeah, I think Spurs have to, and it's been bizarre, frankly, that the fact that the club's, I think, gone into 3 of the last 7 seasons with Kane as the only centre forward on the books, and partly I think that was a consequence of having Son and kind of latterly Lucas as well, and the feeling that they would do just as well as anyone you could sign. But I just think in many ways that's just been an unacceptable situation, and not not a kind of one-off either. As I said, 3 times in 7 seasons. It's put too much strain on Kane. It's kind of unbalanced the squad, and it is really hard to sign a centre forward to play back up to Kane, but I don't think it's impossible.
Dan, in future transfer windows, in particular the summer one, do you think that we will ever go to Premier League teams to try and get Premier League proven players rather than foreign leagues like Serie A?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always what you want to do, really, get someone who is going to be Premier League proven. But it's just incredibly difficult because you're having to play a premium, and clubs don't want to lose their players to direct rivals. So kind of for obvious reasons, it's a lot harder. It was kind of interesting to hear Conte talk about Bentancourt and Kulusevski, because he was very clear that he thought they were players that could immediately kind of play in the Premier League, and they had a certain, I guess, physicality, and they could cope with the intensity. And I think the implication was probably that Hill and Ndombele and maybe Lo Celso, weren't suited to the intensity of English football in the same way. So I think it won't matter that much if Spurs don't sign players from Premier League rivals, as long as they've done due diligence and they're sure that they're players that will be able to adapt to the Premier League. And I think Conte's obviously suggested that he thinks that hasn't been the case previously. He said he doesn't think Spurs really did their due diligence on Brian Hill, I think, for example. And if that's one change that he makes, making sure that everyone who comes in can play Premier League football kind of immediately, then it won't really matter. It's always a risk, but it won't matter as much that they're not kind of able to plunder, Southampton and whoever in perhaps the same way that they once were.
In terms, then, Dan, of players coming in and players going out the door in the summer, what are you expecting?
Well, look, I don't want to name names, but I think kind of
in
obviously,
terms of numbers?
yeah. I mean, really hard to say. I mean, I would certainly expect, and a new centre half, at least one. I think that's definitely top of the wish list, along with the right wing back. So there's two already. Depending on Ndombele, Lo Celso, and Hill, you'd definitely expect a new central midfielder in there. I think a new striker, as we've said. So we're already on 4 or 5, and then I think there's questions over backup goalkeeper. Is Galini the man long term? There's questions over left wing back as well. There's questions in almost every position in the team, I would say. So I'd certainly expect Spurs to be trying to get kind of 5 or 6. Maybe another summer of the Magnificent Seven is not out of the question. But yeah, there's clearly a lot of work to do, and obviously it can't all be left till the last week.
Let's hope so. Dan, last question for you. For someone who travels to, home and away to see Tottenham play, 2008 was our last trophy. When are the trophies coming? And do you really realistically think that Antonio Conte will be the next Spurs manager to lift a trophy?
Whew. Yeah, I mean, good question. Look, there's no doubt that Conte is a winner, and everything I think he's saying and doing, whether or not that kind of hits the right notes every time with supporters and the club, everything I think he's saying and doing is geared toward building a winning team. That's what he's all about. So I think there's certainly a very, very good chance that, if, and it's a big if, but if, he gets what he wants, and, if, he stays at the club, then he would be the man to kind of end that long drought. I couldn't say when, but, I guess you'll be looking at next season, right? When he's got a squad that he feels is more his own, when he's had a pre-season, when he's got the whole campaign to work with. I don't think Spurs will win the league next season, but I certainly think they could have a good crack at a better crack at one of the cup competitions than they have done in recent years. So yeah, I like to be optimistic about Conte being the guy to kind of end that barren period.
Brilliant. Well, Dan, I can't thank you enough for all your time today. Thank you so much, and tell everyone where they can find you and your fantastic work.
Yeah, I will do. Thanks for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'll speak to you soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you on the next video. Come on, you Spurs.